There is a shape sitting in your driveway right now, a hatchback, a tall boot lid that swings up, a flat load floor, seats that fold down to swallow whatever you throw at them. You know this shape. Everyone does. It is the most common car body on Earth, and almost nobody alive today can tell you who invented it. It was not the Volkswagen Golf. Everyone assumes it was the Golf, but the Golf came almost a decade later. The real answer is French. The real answer is a car called the Renault 16. And what happened to it afterward is one of the most unfair stories in automotive history. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why being first is never enough. You will understand how a car can reinvent an entire industry and still get erased from memory. And you will understand exactly what it cost Renault to watch someone else take the glory. Let's go back to the beginning. France, early 1960s. Renault had just pulled itself out of financial trouble with a cheap, tough little car called the Renault 4, launched in 1961. The 4 saved the company. It was the first small Renault since the war to put the engine at the front, and the first Renault passenger car with front-wheel drive, but it was never meant to be the flagship. It was survival, not ambition. It sold in huge numbers because it was cheap, simple, and honest, not because it was glamorous. The real ambition started quietly, under a project codename inside the company, Project 115. Renault's chief executive, Pierre Dreyfus, wanted something bigger. Something that could compete with proper family saloons, but think completely differently about what a family actually needed from a car. He put a designer named Gaston Juchet in charge of the studies. Juchet was not just a stylist, he was an industrial designer and an aerodynamics engineer too. Working alongside him was Claude Prostdame, who led the bodywork design team. Together, they assembled something unusually rare for the time, a small, tightly focused unit, combining design, engineering, and manufacturing thinking from day one. Instead of throwing the problem over the wall from one department to the next, here is the first thing nobody tells you. The Renault 16 was not just a car with a hatch. It was engineered around an entirely new idea, the two-box body. One box for the engine, one box for everything else, passengers and cargo, sharing the same space, separated only by folding seats, with a fifth door at the back to access it all. Before this, if you wanted cargo space, you bought an estate car. If you wanted comfort and style, you bought a saloon. The Renault 16 said, why choose? It offered 6 windows, generous glass all around, and an unusually large one-piece body side panel that was genuinely difficult to manufacture at the time, but gave the car a smooth, uninterrupted silhouette nobody else had. The rear bench did something almost no family car of the era could do. It folded flat. It slid forward and backward on rails, letting owners choose between more legroom or more boot space, depending on the day. It could turn the back of the car into a flat loading bay in seconds, no tools, no effort. Picture yourself in 1965, walking into a Renault showroom, and a salesman folds that seat down in front of you like a magic trick. That was the moment ordinary drivers understood. This is not just another family saloon. This is something new. Now here's a detail almost nobody talks about, and it tells you everything about how differently engineers thought back then. The Renault 16 used torsion bar suspension at the rear, and because of how those bars were mounted, one side of the car actually had a longer wheelbase than the other. The left side stretched further than the right, not by much, but it was real, and it was intentional. It let Renault give the car independent suspension on all 4 corners, at a time when that was still rare on affordable family cars. A strange compromise, hiding a genuine technical leap, and one that gave the 16 a famously soft, comfortable ride that road testers of the era compared to gliding rather than driving. The gear lever wasn't on the floor either. It was mounted on the steering column, paired with a 4-speed, all-synchromesh gearbox, considered one of the best of its type. It sounds old-fashioned today, but at the time it freed up space for a proper, wide front bench seat, so 3 people could sit comfortably up front. Under the bonnet sat something else worth mentioning. Renault claimed it as Europe's first mass-produced engine with a die-cast aluminium cylinder block. A genuine engineering flex wrapped inside an ordinary family car. Every choice on this car was in service of the same idea: maximum comfort, maximum flexibility, minimum compromise. And it worked. The car had its formal debut at the Geneva Motor Show in March of 1965, went on sale that June, and reached Britain in right-hand drive form by the end of the year, quickly becoming one of the most popular imported cars in the country. Then, in 1966, the Renault 16 was voted European Car of the Year. Read that again. 1966, only the third year the award had ever existed. It became the first French car, and the first non-British car, ever to win it. It beat a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow into second place, and an Oldsmobile Toronado into third. A Rolls-Royce. A car many times the price, representing an entirely different world of engineering, and this practical French family hatchback beat it fair and square, in front of a panel of Europe's toughest motoring journalists. The award itself had only existed since 1964, when a Rover and an Austin had split the honors as the first two winners, both British, both conventional. The Renault 16 broke that pattern entirely, and it did it with a car built for ordinary families, not for executives or racing drivers. It's also worth remembering what the Renault 16 replaced inside the company itself: the Renault Frégate, a conventional saloon that had limped through the 1950s and sold barely 160,000 units in nearly a decade on sale. The contrast could not have been sharper. Where the Frégate quietly disappointed, the 16 arrived like a statement proof that Renault could build something the entire industry would eventually copy. Renault didn't stand still after that win either. Through the late 1960s, they kept sharpening the range. In March of 1968, at the Geneva Motor Show, they introduced the 16 TS, a version with a bigger, 1.6-liter engine, capable of topping 100 miles an hour. A genuinely quick figure for a practical family hatchback of that era. An automatic transmission version, the 16 TA, followed at Geneva the next year. And by 1969, the 16 gained reversing lights, power windows, an electric sunroof, even leather upholstery on higher trims. In 1973, Renault topped the range with the TX, adding a 5-speed manual gearbox and central door locking, a feature almost nobody had seen before on a family car. This was a car that started as a clever, practical solution and grew into something genuinely prestigious. Owners weren't just buying transport. They were buying entry into a new kind of automotive life: flexible, modern, and undeniably French. One British advertisement from the period called it, quite plainly, today's car for today's man. Before we go further, if this kind of real automotive history is something you enjoy, this is exactly the channel for you. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming, because the next part of this story is where it gets painful. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me if you ever rode in, drove, or even just remember seeing a Renault 16 on the road. I want to know. And if you're enjoying this, a like helps more than you'd think, and sharing it with a friend who loves classic cars means the world. Now, here's the part where the numbers get serious. Production of the Renault 16 ran from 1965 all the way to 1980, 15 years. Roughly 1.85 million units built, most of them at the purpose-built Sandouville plant near Le Havre in Normandy, with additional assembly at Flins in France. Export sales made up almost half of everything sold. It was assembled under license in Australia, in Canada, in what was then Yugoslavia, and in Morocco. This was not a niche success. This was a car that quietly rewired what family car meant across an entire continent, and by the time it finally retired, most other European manufacturers had at least one hatchback of their own in their lineup, a market Renault itself had helped invent, and now dominated with a full range of them, from the small 4 and 5, right up through the 6, the 14, and the 20. But, and this is important, it never cracked America. Renault tried. They built a special version tailored for the US market. It barely mattered. Numbers there stayed tiny. and the car never became part of the American car conversation the way it did across the English Channel or in France itself. And that detail matters more than it seems, because it's part of the reason the car's legend never crossed the Atlantic the way it should have. A car's fame, it turns out, depends heavily on which side of the ocean gets to fall in love with it. Now let's talk about the part nobody wants to admit. While the Renault 16 was still sitting in showrooms, quietly aging into its second decade, something else was happening in Germany. Volkswagen had a problem. Their entire company was built on one car, the Beetle. And by the early 1970s, the Beetle was dying. Sales were sliding, the design was ancient, and the world had moved on. Volkswagen needed a replacement, and this time, they needed it to be perfect. There was no room for a second failure. They went to an Italian designer named Giorgetto Giugiaro, a man who had already shaped some of the most important cars of his generation. Volkswagen gave him a brief: front engine, front-wheel drive, hatchback, practical, modern, minimalist. In March of 1974, production began. The first cars reached customers in May. It was called the Golf, reportedly named after the Gulf Stream, following Volkswagen's habit of naming cars after winds and currents. In the United States and Canada, it was sold as the Rabbit. In Mexico, it became the Caribe. Here is the part that should sting if you love the Renault 16. The Golf's basic formula: front engine, front-wheel drive, transverse two-box hatchback body, folding rear seats, was not new. It was the same fundamental idea the Renault 16 had already proven worked, almost 10 years earlier. The Golf refined it, tightened it, made it about 165 kilograms lighter than the Beetle it replaced, and wrapped the whole thing in sharper, more modern, almost origami-like styling. Giugiaro later called it the best design of his entire career, a career that also included the Alfa Romeo Giulia Sprint and the BMW M1. But the blueprint, the core idea, had already been written in France in 1965. And yet the Golf is the one everybody remembers. Watch what happened next, because this is the real gut punch. The Golf sold 1 million units by October of 1976, barely 2.5 years after launch. By the time production of the original Golf ended in the early 1980s, well over 6 million had been built, and that was just the beginning. Volkswagen kept the formula alive in South Africa for another 25 years under the City Golf name. Across every generation since, the Volkswagen Golf has gone on to become the best-selling car in European history, with more than 37 million units delivered worldwide. The name Golf didn't just label a car, it became shorthand for an entire class of vehicle. To this day, people still describe a whole segment of the market as Golf class. Along the way, it picked up trophy after trophy too. Car of the Year honors in Brazil in 1976, in Ireland in 1978, and from British magazine What Car in 1981. Every one of those awards added another layer of legend onto a car that was, underneath all of it, still running the same basic idea the Renault 16 had already proven a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the Renault 16 quietly ended production in January of 1980. It was replaced by the Renault 20, a car that, by most accounts, never matched the ambition or the impact of its predecessor. The 16 didn't fail. It simply stopped, its job done, its legacy handed unknowingly, unwillingly, to a car built by a rival company in another country almost a decade later. Think about what that really means. The car that proved hatchbacks could be practical, comfortable, and genuinely desirable. The car that beat a Rolls-Royce for Car of the Year became a footnote in most people's memory. And the car that came along nearly 10 years later, using the same fundamental idea, became one of the most famous vehicles ever built, one that outsold almost everything else on the continent. Generation after generation. This is not really a story about cars. This is a story about timing, marketing, and memory. The Renault 16 had no beloved predecessor to replace, no desperate global brand crisis forcing the entire world to pay attention to its arrival. The Golf had the full weight of Volkswagen's survival riding on it, and a legendary designer's name attached to help sell the story. Being first only gets you into the history books. It does not guarantee you a place in people's hearts, and it certainly doesn't guarantee you a place in the driveway of the next generation. If you're old enough to remember the roads of the 60s and 70s, you might have seen a Renault 16 without even knowing what you were looking at. A strange, boxy silhouette gliding along the motorway. A seat that folded flat like nothing else on the road at the time. A grille shaped a little like a bird's beak, one that a later Renault design chief admitted he quietly borrowed decades afterward for cars like the Laguna and the Megane, because he never stopped admiring the original. It was there, doing the hard, unglamorous work of proving an idea years before anyone gave that idea a famous name, a famous designer, or a famous marketing campaign. Here's what makes this even harder to sit with. Renault themselves, by the late 1970s, had 6 different hatchbacks on sale at once: the 4, the 5, the 6, the 14, the 16 itself, and the incoming 20. They had built an entire company around the format the 16 pioneered. And still, when people talk about the car that invented the modern hatchback, most reach instinctively for a German name instead of a French one. That's not an accident of history. That's the result of one company telling its story louder, and at a more desperate, more urgent moment than the other ever did. So here's what I want you to take from this. Innovation, without a story attached to it, fades. The world does not automatically reward the inventor. It rewards whoever tells the better story, at the better moment, to the right audience, with the right desperation behind it. The Renault 16 deserved more credit than history gave it. It deserved to be the name people reach for first, not second. And now, at least for the next few minutes of your life, you know the truth, and you know exactly why the credit ended up somewhere else. If this story meant something to you, do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Real machines, real history, no nonsense, and no invented drama. Leave a comment and tell me one thing you remember from this video, whether it's the Rolls-Royce it beat for Car of the Year, the seat that folded flat before anyone else's did, or the fact that the Golf borrowed its whole idea from a car built almost a decade earlier. Hit like if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of history. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a piece of real automotive history done properly, send this to them right now. They'll thank you for it. The Renault 16 didn't lose the argument. It just never got the chance to tell its own story, in its own time, in its own words. Today, you told it for them.